Good morning. I trust everyone had a good time last night. Nice to see so many here. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to make it. It was a late night, but it was a great party. Really enjoyed it, and again, thanks to the host for putting that on. It was a wonderful event. Well, I'd just like to begin this morning by thanking IMGL for arranging a couple of panels for us this morning. It is part of the whole IAGRA program, and they've generously, provided us with speakers this morning and moderators, and I think they're going to do a great job giving us some education, and it conforms with their education program, so I think it's a nice synergy that the two organizations are working well together. And again, I'll now turn this over to Wayne and Garrett. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dale. We believe there are a number of casualties of last night, and it certainly appears that way. So part of what we were looking to do on the last day of this event is to make this a rather interactive panel discussion, first of all in terms of the delegates that are sitting on the table, but the idea is to stimulate debate, not to have too much of a set format, and certainly we understand there's an interactive system where questions can be put up. We would encourage questions, we would encourage comments and debate. Our first panel is on online gambling in general in terms of regulation, regulatory models, and in this regard we've got a very distinguished panel. Obviously I've introduced my partner, Garen Weitzman, who will together with me moderate the session. Next to him we have Mike Burns. Mike Burns is currently a group compliance manager with one of the largest bookmaking groups in South Africa. Prior to that, he has a 20-year history as a regulator, lastly in a senior position with the National Gambling Board, and prior to that, 30 years in operations, so a wealth of knowledge there. Next to him is Andre Wilsonach, who's currently a professor at the University of Las Vegas in Nevada, and prior to that has a long career as a regulator in Albany, which needs no introduction in terms of online gambling regulation, and prior to that was a local regulator with the Mpumalanga Gambling Board. Next to him is Nick Tofelak, who is a very senior executive in the UK Gambling Commission in the operations section, and prior to that was a policeman for many years and had a long career in that regard. Next to him is one of our hosts, the COO of the Gauteng Gambling Board, a long-time regulator, one of the longest-standing provincial regulators in the country, Edward Lalumbe, and prior to that, a practicing attorney. On his right, we have Advocate Themba Ngobezi, who is currently the CEO of the Casino Association of South Africa. Prior to that was also a compliance official, senior compliance executive in a large casino group, and a qualified advocate. So without much ado, we'd like to start off with some comments from Edward Lalumbe in terms of the current high-level regulatory approach to online gambling on an international basis. And just after that, Andre Wilsonach will run through a few slides just to stimulate some further debate, and hopefully at that stage the conversation will be flowing. Thanks, Edward.
Yeah, throughout the world, there are three broad regulatory approaches to online gambling. The first approach is prohibition. These are countries which consciously took the decision to prohibit gambling. South Africa partially falls into this category. The second category relates to those who adopted what I may call wait-and-see attitude. They have neither pronounced that they prohibit it or regulate it. It just happens on its own. And there are a number of countries that fall into this category. The third and the last category is those countries that have taken a deliberate decision to regulate and control online gambling. We've seen the latest countries, Nevada, Australia, and if you look at Africa, we've got Tanzania that promulgated legislation to legalize online gambling, and Kenya has adopted the approach of doing a test case to issue an exclusive license to see how the market will grow. So South Africa, it's a hybrid approach in terms of online. it prohibits the casino-style form of online gambling, while on the other side it has legalized online betting. So you are able to take bets through either a mobile or internet in South Africa. So the distinction between gambling that takes place in cyberspace through the internet and those you use communication, either a phone or internet, to communicate the outcome or place a bet. So there's that distinction. Hence it puts South Africa partially on the prohibition and partially on the legalization. I think in broad, that's the approach throughout the world in terms of the regulation and control of online gambling.
All right, thanks for that, Edward. Andre, are you ready to give us a few slides?
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Wayne and Garen had agreed that I put up a few slides, and really just a few. I hope not to cause death by PowerPoint this morning. But I hope this may be able to stimulate some thought. Over the last year, I've had the opportunity to advised and be involved in a number of jurisdictions around the world that's thinking about online gaming. And what I thought I might do is just share with you briefly some of the considerations that we see around the world. The first consideration is normally channel to market. The second one is product vertical, and I'll explain that a little bit. And then if we're going to allow the online channel, and we've talked about products, then normally the next step is which operator are we going to allow to operate? And then if we've decided that, then normally the next one is let's talk about regulation. I'm just going to quickly scan through a few of these slides. The channel to market is normally an interesting one. We all know that there's two channels to market generally in commerce today, offline and online. Business worldwide uses multiple channels to market. We see it in the hospitality, the entertainment, travel, finance, and also in the gaming industry. That's prevalent in Europe, Canada, in Australia today. It's not so prevalent in the US. And the common arguments against online gambling is normally that it poses a threat to the growth of the offline channel, the whole cannibalization effect. And this is normally a concern that you have within legislators, where you already have offline gaming. And I can see a number of jurisdictions where I know that these are sort of debates that they go through, is the fears around what's the impact of online going to be on offline. It results in high levels of problem gambling, they say. It's difficult to effectively regulate. This is particularly an argument that's used in the US. It's interesting if you look just a little bit about what statistics tells us about the online sector. If you just look at the 2016 figures, we already see that in what so-called white markets, that online gaming, in terms of the percentage of global iGaming gross win, is already at the levels of 50 to 60%. You can see the growth there. If you look at mobile, that's an interesting figure. I mean, we're going for almost 40% of the market. It's interesting, this slide, if you look at the different regions around the world, you can see in the middle you've got that large green one, which represents Europe. So that's where most of the online gaming sector takes place, with Asia at the top and very little in the US. The next one is the gambling product, the next consideration. And that's about which product vertical are we going to allow to regulate. And normally there's a battle around betting and casinos and poker and so on. And you would get at the policy level, the discussion is normally, yeah, we will allow betting, but we're not going to allow online gaming or poker or state lotteries. It's interesting that if you look at the product verticals around the world in terms of gross win, you would see that betting is by far the largest component, followed by casino gaming. The product verticals are normally those betting, casino, poker, and so on. Policymakers often make the mistake to restrict product verticals, and we see that as well, where they restrict it to a particular product vertical. You all know about Nevada, where they only allow poker, for example, but not any of the other verticals. The difficulty with that, obviously, is that the player wants to play all of the verticals. And so now he's restricted by only being given access to one product vertical, and that obviously causes frustration. And then the player has to go somewhere else to play that game. And then the question is, where does he play the game? Is he protected when he plays that game? Etc., etc. It's normally aimed at protecting existing industries or to limit problem gambling. But the implications are clearly that it forces players, as I've just said, to find their preferred gaming product elsewhere in the world. It leaves players unprotected, and it causes valuable player funds to leave the country. That's very much the situation in South Africa at the moment, where you've only got one product vertical that's been licensed. As Edward has just said, at the moment it's primarily betting, but not any of the others are permitted, and you find that there's probably, Edward, I'm sure you will agree, a large flow of funds going outside South Africa. As far as the gambling operator is concerned, which is the third consideration, the question is normally who should we allow to operate? If we're going to allow the second channel, who do we license? Should it be the state? Should it be the private sector? And in some jurisdictions, they prefer to go with the state. In some private sector, should it be restricted only to existing offline operators? And I suspect if South Africa would go down this route, Edward, that's probably the route that they would follow. I don't know. The questions, those sort of questions, often assume that the state understands the consumer's needs best, that the state is best positioned to protect the interest of the player, the state is best able to protect growth and tax revenues, and existing offline licensees are best suited to operate that sector. Now, in some jurisdictions, they've moved away from it. If you look at Denmark today, it's totally open. They have not stuck with the offline, but in some jurisdictions they feel more comfortable with just having the offline operator doing it. And then my experience is normally too much emphasis is being placed on the entity that contracts with the end user, and therefore you get this situation where a lot of focus is being given in policy debates about that relationship between the player and the operator facing the player. At policy level, there's normally not a consideration about affiliates. There's normally not enough attention being given to the operators, the platforms, the B2B level below the operators facing the customer, and therefore the debate is often too narrow. And then they don't even think about we should license the suppliers. And when you put all of that in context, you just confuse the debate even more. The gambling environment is obviously one that they have to consider about, and the considerations are clearly tax dispensation. How comprehensive should the regulatory framework be? Should it be a strong, independent, non-political regulator? Should it be a regulator within government? And then there's the whole issue of how much power do you give the regulator? And then there's obviously a whole host of considerations which starts with crime, keeping crime out, ensuring compliance, etc., etc. So those are just a few remarks of what I've seen around the world, and I hope that might help.
Thanks very much, Andre. Moving to some of our panel members, Mark, would you like to comment on?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I've got a few remarks to make. First remark I want to make is somewhat vague. All the jurisdictions that are here today, there's not a one shoe fits all kind of scenario. In the African context, for us, with unemployment at all-time highs of 27.7%, job creation in a land-based environment, in bricks and mortar casinos. Everybody thinks tax and money plays a role because it goes to good causes. That we all understand. But job creation is critical. In countries such as the US with 5.6% unemployment, some of the Nordic countries, and I've made some notes, Sweden 8.1, and I don't vouch for the accuracy of these statistics, so please don't smack me around the ears when we finish here. Denmark 5.6, Finland 8.9, etc., etc. For them, the situation would be different. It's not about job creation as such, but in our environment, it is important. Correcting the imbalances of the past is important. We've got a legacy where a illegitimate regime was in control of the, who were in the minority, were in control of the majority. We've corrected those imbalances, but we haven't set all the records straight, and we're in the process of doing that. So in our current environment, even as an operator who should be saying, hallelujah, please allow it, I'm saying we must have a cautious approach to this sort of situation. And we must remember something Andre touched on. I don't necessarily agree that only the bricks and mortar operators should be the operators in an online environment, but they should have some form of protection for the investment that they had made over the years prior to the online environment coming into effect. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when you come up with something new. Thank you very much.
Can I just comment on that? You have an interesting debate at the moment in Massachusetts on exactly that issue. And the reason for that is that the casinos, the offline casinos, have been given exclusivity. So what do you do when you now license the offline channel in terms of exclusivity? That puts you in a fairly precarious position, and therefore you're probably going to struggle to move away from that sort of situation where you license them to a totally open market situation.
I have a more fundamental question, and that goes really to the setting of policy relating to any type of gambling activities or not. I mean, we're sitting here, obviously we have some operators, there's some lawyers amongst us, but by and large everyone else here are regulators. Now, I've always taken the view that regulators are here to regulate based upon the policy that's been set. So the question, of course, Mike mentions questions of unemployment, questions of perhaps entrenched rights of land-based casinos, as did Andre in respect to Massachusetts. The bigger and fundamental question for me is, where does the drive need to come from in respect of allowing online gambling, which has without a doubt been many times more controversial than land-based gambling itself? Does one set the policy purely at a governmental level? Does one set the policy taking into account existing interests? Or does one set the policy based on the progress that's happening in the world, which we cannot deny, with everything going more online, as well as the mores of the society which that government is seeking to regulate? What is the correct basis to even look at the expansion of gambling activities and or the permission or permissive nature of gambling regulation? I'm not sure what the thinking is. I mean, how much debate actually around the world is taking place as to the actual core of whether we allow online gambling or not. You take, for example, the South African regulator or the South African government, particularly the Department of Trade and Industry, saying we don't want to expand gambling in South Africa. Basically, we don't think it's a good thing, but we realize it's happening. We've got the UK, who takes a much more permissive but very heavily regulated approach. We have other jurisdictions who say no, not at all, and we have other jurisdictions who are even more permissive than the UK. What's the basis upon which we do this?
I see Temba's looking to jump in. It was Temba that wanted to jump in there, and then perhaps we can hear from Edward or Nick.
Good morning, everyone. I think everyone knows that I'm from the Casino Association of South Africa. Just one or two remarks on our side so that this debate is a bit fairly balanced, and to correct a few misconceptions, because I know people automatically conclude that as casino operators we totally opposed to legalization of online gambling, which is actually very far from the truth. I don't know whether fortunately or unfortunately I'm not a swimmer. I can't swim. But I have been told that it's very difficult to swim against the tide. And that's what we seem to be doing. If you remember, for those that are South Africans, our discussions have always been around, look, government must decide what they want to do, whether to legalize it or not. But our stance was that whatever you do, if you're going to prohibit it, please just make sure that it doesn't happen. Sadly, that approach has failed. And then otherwise we just legalize it and go on. From where we're seated, I think the frustration is that as licensed casino operators, we can't dare go into that space. But at the same time, it's happening nonetheless. That is not an ideal situation, especially considering that we are on the ground, we've invested, Empress Palace being one of those properties. So our view is very simple. We've tried the prohibition approach. It has failed dismally. And I don't see it succeeding, to be honest with you. So then we need to now be looking at other considerations. Of course, for us, we're very clear. You can't avoid it. This is where technology is taking us. You can't dictate with technology, unfortunately. The more you try to dictate it, it really just runs away. Unfortunately, with due respect, regulators will always be chasing, will always be coming from behind, because technology moves much, much faster than the framework and the legislation. So certainly we are now at a stage where we do need to legalize it. We are very late in the scheme of things. And of course, we then need to be talking about who do we give these licenses to. And one of the considerations, and I'm certainly not advocating that exclusivity for the offline casino operators or the brick and mortar casinos, but clearly one of the things that regulators will have to think about is the fact that there's already infrastructure, there's people employed on the ground, and clearly, to me, it's much easier to transition people from your brick and mortar stroke offline casinos to the online space without necessarily advocating a clearly exclusive approach for online gambling being offered only by brick and mortar or offline casinos.
I'd be very interested to hear from Nick, as one of the vanguard regulators in this space, his comments. But before I pass on to him, something I would like to raise is in line with what Themba's mentioned with regard to prohibition. And it's unfortunately something that Garrett and I see a lot of in our South African practice with regard to prohibition, and that is in terms of enforcement. Currently, there's a very unfortunate approach from a national level in terms of going after players. So tracing credit card transactions, for want of, to try and summarize in non-technical terms, but tracing credit card transactions through the Reserve Bank mechanism, and then approaching, the retired pensioner that's playing online with a non-regulated illegal casino overseas, and bringing heavy sanctions against that player. And I have always viewed personally, and I'm sure many will agree, enforcement against the player that's exposed to the online activity as a very distasteful method and form of regulation, where you're not really dealing with the problem. And this goes to the principle of, in South Africa certainly, and many common law countries where our law emerges from, in terms of the law being seen to be done, the law being seen to be effected. If we are going to prohibit, then prohibition needs to be done properly, and not just against the player, but against the person making the activity available to the player. And it seems that we unfortunately can't even get prohibition right, which also, to add to what Themba has mentioned, brings us to our unique situation in South Africa, where we have 11 gambling regulators. We've got 9 provincial regulators, because we're a quasi-federal state. We've got 1 national gambling regulator and a national lottery regulator. And then we've got a plethora of legislation that goes with it, 11 acts, which to some degree are inconsistent with each other. And to say what Themba was reluctant to say himself, because he carries the casino flag, but it seems to me, and I'm going to put this theory out there, that for further debate, that our provincial regulators are perhaps even in a position, given their concurrent competency constitutionally to regulate the area of gambling, to issue provincial licenses to their local licensees, their local casino licensees, and almost have an exclusive regime, where online gambling can simply be an add-on product, where the site or the software that provides the online gambling can be tested. It can be authorized by the board, and the licensees can be allowed to do that, which would be a somewhat, I guess, undesirable position in terms of open market. But anyway, I don't want to take up too much of the floor.
I would certainly not object.
Let me add something to that, and then before we hand over to Nick, based on what Wayne has said, is, first of all, the operator who the local party is gambling with may not be licensed here, but invariably they're licensed somewhere else. This is one of the major issues relating to the borderless nature of online gambling. So they're not licensed here, but they're probably licensed with a very, very good regulator somewhere else in the world. That's the first thing. The second thing is, it's very clear that prohibition doesn't work, in my view, in any event. And because it doesn't work, one actually has to look at a more effective regulatory regime. What I've certainly found in the last, particularly the last number of years, and we act for, many of the international operators actually, not only in respect to the South African operations, but because of the peculiar nature of lawyering within the online gambling environment, one tends to actually not only act for people within one's jurisdiction, but also for people in respect to the international businesses, that operators are growing more and more inclined to actually regulate, because the world has changed. They're looking to grow value within their businesses. They're looking for exits. They're looking for the ability to actually do things on a regulated basis. And they've accepted what's become almost the UK/European norm, that if you want to be in a territory, you almost invariably need to license. So we're dealing with an operator mindset that's actually coming within, as far as I'm concerned, the grey market/black market type of operation, how online gambling really started off, into a mindset of we're actually okay to be regulated as long as we can trade. There's the other issue as well, and we see it as not just South Africa. For example, in any of the federal territories, the US, Germany, we're seeing it in Australia as well, where federal level control is clashing with state level control. And of course, this gives rise to another very particular problem within the online gambling space, and the question as to whether online gambling should be regulated rather at a federal level, given its borderless nature, rather than at a state level. So those are certainly questions that I would like to address through this panel and as part of the discussion. Nick, Wayne, you wanted to ask Nick some questions?
No, I wanted to have some comments. I see Edward. Are you looking to make a comment?
Yeah, I think you've raised a fundamental legal question pertaining to South Africa. You argue that in terms of the framework, the provincial gambling boards have the legal capacity currently to issue online licenses. I have a different perspective to that. If you look at the Constitution, Schedule 4 grants equal powers to national and provincial government in relation to the regulation and control of gambling. However, these rights are not absolute. The national framework has the power to determine norms and standards relating to gambling. Whilst we have concurrent powers, in certain respects, national legislation will overrule provincial legislation. And in some respects, provincial legislation will overrule national. So the instances where provincial will overrule national, it's where it relates to a matter that can be effectively regulated within a particular jurisdiction or province. Now, if you look at the powers of national, the power to set norms and standards relating to the republic in general, they've moved ahead to determine a norm that online gambling will be regulated at a national level. So any attempts at this stage to venture into that sphere to try and pass legislation which will contrary to the current national norm will be unlawful and unconstitutional.
Well, I'm glad you took up the debate because of course, the situation practically to be the opposite with sports betting. So currently in South Africa, and this goes to one of the theories that Andre put up on the board in terms of limited verticals, we have sports betting allowed nationally, but licensed by one province. And the Western Cape province have been quite forward-thinking in terms of allowing even a back office operator. So in other provinces, you have to have a shop in that province, and then the online, which extends around the country, is an extension of that shop presence. In the Western Cape, one doesn't even need to have a shop. One can have a back office and then provide that sports betting around the country. So there are a number of holes. And interestingly enough, what I seem to believe to be the case is the more regulation you have, in other words, with our 11 Act in this country, the more holes one finds and the easier it is for situations like that to persist and prevail.
I think we're mixing issues. The delivery of a game should not determine the essence of a game. So online is a medium through which games are delivered. So in terms of the current norm, interactive, anything casino style that is offered through the medium of internet is classified as online and is prohibited. But if you look at sports betting, you're using the medium of internet to communicate. The current legislation has contemplated phone, internet, etc., as a means of communicating a bet and communicating back the acceptance of the wager. There is no determination of the results in that context. So, which is contrary to where you have online casino-style gambling, where the outcome, the results is determined in cyberspace. They're fundamentally different.
You see, I think what you raise is an interesting issue in terms of whether the medium, whether the underlying game and the medium fall within the purview of a national ban where we have provincial enablement. So where does one draw the line? In other words, would a server-based environment in a provincial context be acceptable? And if it is acceptable, then why would that not be able to extend beyond the boundaries of that particular province or state? Which is why I believe in the United States, you have compacts developing between Nevada, New Jersey, and Delaware. And obviously that's going to mushroom. So I think also what you've highlighted, Edward, is a situation not necessarily particular to us. We're at a federal level. We have a prohibitive outlook, and at a provincial level we have an enabling outlook, and there's a lot of crossover in the issues. But before we continue that debate, I did want to hear from Nick on a point that was raised earlier in terms of balancing, because we started to go down the road of talking about the job creation in land-based versus online, and the land-based industry versus the online industry. And of course in the UK we have both, and I would like to just have a comment from Nick on that particular issue, how the Gaming Commission in the UK looks to balance that and their views.
Thank you. I don't feel qualified to comment upon specific South African approaches, but I think what I would say is that the debate about remote is often, in my observation, focused upon what you should do to regulate without much attention on why you should regulate in the first instance. And I think if I use the UK example, I think regulation in general is a combination of two licenses before you even get to the legal term of licenses, and that's a political license, and that in itself is linked to a social license. So what is the culture of the country? What is the expectation of its citizenry? And how does that manifest itself through the political process? And in Britain, in one sense, this came to a head back in 2003-04 with something called the Budd Report, which essentially laid out a revision of the social position as well as the existing and emergent political position as to what we thought about gambling. And in very broad terms, the conclusion was that it was a leisure activity enjoyed by millions without problem, but there were risks, and it had to be accepted that there were risks, and that in the course of liberalising, let's call it that, then there was need for constant review. And that set the framework for the political and social licence for the regulatory approach. Now, the other question that occurs to me sometimes is that one of the challenges of policymakers is to think slightly ahead and ask the question, is it possible to enact this policy? And some of the constrictions on enacting policy are things such as federal structures, non-federal structures. Is it a capability that law enforcement has, or is it any organisation's existing capability? Will you have to start again? And sometimes I think policy, both in terms of regulation and in terms of law, sometimes misses out the due diligence work as to how would this policy best be enacted. And in one sense, the existence of a very strong non-remote sector is a consideration as to how you're going to put your policy framework into action, because there will be tensions, there will be competitions, there will be threats perceived, and there will be advantages. And that is not an easy thing to work out. And in moving from the Budd Report through to the Gambling Act, that's been a constant tension in the UK. But it has been somewhat eased by the fact that we have taken a number of, I suppose, strategic statements and say, first of all, if you are going to be licensed, then the primary responsibility for managing the risk to the consumer and keeping crime out lies with the operator. So in one sense, that put the level of prescription that we were going to enact somewhat down the order. So we made some very definite statements that we're going to operate with primary responsibility going to the operator. Second thing is that we have increasingly taken what I call a whole market approach, which, given that demand for gambling products in the UK is high, it's socially and culturally accepted, particularly sports betting has been for centuries, then the way in which we tend to think about the regulation of online is in the context of influencing the supply side and influencing the demand side. Now, the demand side is the consumer, but the supply side is licensed, it's unlicensed, it's remote, it's non-remote. And picking up the point about criminalisation of the consumer or not, the reality is, when we think about our policy framework, is the consumer, because we don't criminalise, is free to choose. Is free to choose between illegal and is free to choose between remote and non-remote. And they compete on price, on quality, on trust continually. And so our regulation is developed in an understanding of that, that context. And finally then, so when you look at supply side and demand side, then we effectively describe our approach as three-stage: prevent, detect, correct. Going back to the fundamental principle, we expect that to be the approach of operators. They must identify the risk that their business are creating. They must mitigate, manage those risks, and must be capable of demonstrating to the regulator that they are effective. And that's the model we've approached. And we don't really differentiate between remote and non-remote. It's just the fact that when you come to the remote, and we are now in a global environment, two things are self-evident. One, that it's much more difficult to engage in the remote space for compliance, for investigation, and there are particular powers that you now need that are often reserved to law enforcement. And secondly, that on the remote front, it's a global enterprise. And therefore information about persons wanting to provide remote services to the UK is held in different parts of the world. And if we are going to be effective, we need to have access to that information, the appropriate access. But on the other hand, we have, I think, an increasing responsibility to share information with other regulators who may also be dealing with that operator, who may want some confirmation as to their ability to deliver or be suitable in different jurisdictions.
Nick, one of the questions that's come through this Slido system actually dovetails with something I was thinking about while you were talking. And the question really is, are there any jurisdictions where the prohibition is effectively controlled online gambling? Now, the UK, there was a fundamental change in the way that the UK did things a few years ago, where it moved from the whitelist sort of dispensation to the point of consumption dispensation. And there was a real rush, I know that, because I was involved in a number of the applications, for operators to be licensed in the UK. Have you found that the incidence of non-licensed gambling, and I'm not sure what empirical evidence there is or research that's been done on it by the UKGC, but have you found that the incidence of unlicensed remote gambling operators targeting UK residents has reduced? If it has it reduced fundamentally? Or has it pretty much stayed the same from the investigations that you guys have done? Because, as I mentioned when I was talking a little bit earlier, there seems to have been a shift in operator attitude as well to regulation, particularly in respect of certain markets. And it's very much a question of the position the regulator has taken and the regard I think operators hold that regulator within, as to whether regulation can in fact be effective, and, for example, is the UK model the way to go? Has it effectively dealt with online gambling and the regulation thereof?
A number of points there. I mean, we have, I brought the data with me, the last set of, we have 540 remote licenses, casino, sports betting and bingo, held by 330 operators at the present moment in time. Now, there has been an increase since 2014 when we changed to point of consumption licensing. And part of that increase is, I think, a realisation that it's in general beneficial to be part of the regulated market. Because in one sense, the regulated market plays to a leveler playing field than the unlicensed irregular market. The other reality, I think, if you think of a market approach, is whilst it's the operator's responsibility to deliver the licensing objectives, part of the benefit of being licensed is that the regulator, in my view, is almost contracting that we will provide a level of protection for that licensed market, primarily for the consumer, but there is a secondary benefit for those that choose to be licensed. And I think that's what's caused, in part, a realisation that it's better to be inside the tent than outside. Now, in terms of the level of unlicensed supply, it's very difficult to be precise. But what we do is we, as part of our approach of detection and correction, is we actively monitor the market for the traffic coming into the UK. And we are putting increased effort into the sophistication with which we can do that. And I know other colleagues in the room are looking at traffic analysis in terms of incoming demand, as it were. Now, we do that alongside surveillance of the remote market through our own compliance and investigators, and we undertake we undertake investigations into those that we detect. Now, it's amazing at one level. No, that's the wrong word, really. It's surprising at one level the amount of silly mistakes are made by people that are technically in breach of the license obligation. And it's pleasing to some extent to see the level of which, when we contact them and issue what we call cease and desist, the response. Now, the reality is that some may simply disguise themselves under another banner or something and move on. But we don't find ourselves overwhelmed with unlicensed suppliers in our current ability to detect. But we're always mindful that seeing what's going on the internet is something that we continually need to be more insightful about. But if you ask me in broad terms, do I think we have do I think that the bulk of online gambling is being provided by unlicensed operators? No, I don't. And I also think that one of the advantages that we have is the amount of information we get from licensed operators about what they think is unfair competition. So our sources of information increased with the number of licensed operators that we had.
Sure, I mean, licensed operators, I think for a long time, we've always accepted are the best policemen of the market.
Yeah.
And very useful for regulators. I know Mike had some questions he wanted to ask.
I first wanted to make a remark. If you choose to prohibit, it doesn't mean it's going to always be effective. We love to point fingers at the police and government and banks when they're not assisting with prohibition. There's a lot of things in various parts of the world, in jurisdictions you all come from, where we've got this wonderful world of make-believe that we all live under, about how wonderful things are. If we take a decision to prohibit, it's not always going to be effective. But that doesn't mean you must automatically turn your back on prohibition and just start issuing licenses willy-nilly. I do, however, see the benefits, tremendous benefits, in regulating online. You know, things that were discussed yesterday, the issue of problem gambling. Now people will turn around and say, well, these are non-face, unknown people. If you follow proper registration policies about how the players will be registered, you will eliminate underage gambling. And by the way, when I mean eliminating underage gambling, I'm not meaning eliminating bad parenting. There is no excuse for bad parenting. It doesn't matter how many regulators are in this room. You can't eliminate bad parenting. So if a father's registered in an online environment and he leaves his username and password on his mouse pad, and the kid comes in and fiddles with it, you can't blame the operator, you can't blame online gambling. But in a properly regulated environment, the benefits of online gambling will eliminate underage gambling. It'll go a long way to curbing the combating of terrorist financing, where people on the United Nations 1267 list, that 156-page document that the United Nations puts out, you'll be able to have programs in place to scour the websites, to scour your group of clients to ensure that they're not on the list. Responsible gambling. You'll be able to flag messages. We discussed the whole day yesterday about responsible gambling. No one spoke to an addict. No one spoke to a problem gambler. Now let me tell you something. If I was sitting at the computer and every hour you flash up and you say you spent 138 euros or 200 krona, and it comes up all the time, it's far more beneficial than me sitting in a land-based casino. So there are benefits. So I struggle to get rid of my bloody regulator's cap, and I ask for forgiveness for that. But it is important.
Mark, I'm not going to forgive you for wearing a regular. No, I'm joking, but I had to interrupt you because I feel there are a number of questions coming from the audience, and you've gone to some level to answer one or two that I saw flash past. Unfortunately, we've got so engrossed in our debate here that we haven't done the audience huge justice, and I saw one on enforcement. So hopefully to some degree your comments now went to addressing the enforcement question that came up earlier. But there is one interesting question. I think what we'll do is we'll also give the members of the audience an opportunity to raise hands and ask questions if they haven't been using the Slidos. Somebody's just flagged on the side here that questions how can regulator effectively curb online gambling, illegal online gambling in their respective jurisdictions. So that to some degree you've assisted us with. There's an interesting question as to technically what is the difference between online gambling and online betting, and this goes back to our question earlier, Edward, our mini debate that we had at this table earlier regarding that, and I think it's quite a nice question to throw open to the panel. I see Edward's going to give us some answer to that.
Yeah, as I said earlier on, the online gambling refers to an incidence where a wagering transaction happens in cyberspace. So all the elements, wager, the processing of the wager and the outcome happens in cyberspace. That's what we call interactive of online in our jurisdiction. Where you use the telephone to place a bet, you use the internet or use your mobile, you are using that device to communicate. It's not to communicate a bet or wager, and also to receive the outcome of wager. And that's where we draw the distinction between online gambling and online betting.
What is the difference between online gambling and online betting? Well, is there really a difference? Is it not a question of feel? Is it not a question of what is being regarded as tolerable based on the social mores? I mean, why are lotteries permissible, but in certain other places online casinos are not? What's really the difference? Why is betting provided and able to be provided in certain places and online casinos not? Why is poker seen by some parties as inappropriate, or betting exchanges, which person to person, as against games, as opposed to games against the house? And why, through all of this, and this will touch slightly on the next panel, do lotteries seem to be acceptable, which are also just as much a form of, particularly if they're offered online gambling? Or are they online betting? Is it just not a question of semantics? You know, these are the policy questions that come up throughout the debates as to what is actually acceptable or not based on the mores. May I just get back to this question of the UK? Because, yeah. Oh, sorry, Tim, do you want to
just on what Edward has answered, because I've had to answer this question also a number of times, because really, and to emphasize what Edward was saying, well, as he said, we know the elements with online gaming, all the elements take place on the internet cyberspace, as opposed to online betting where the elements takes place elsewhere. So it's a match between Liverpool and Manchester. It's the outcome of the World Cup final, but the results are merely communicated using the internet. It could actually even be done through the telephone. So it's exactly the same. So think of the internet as the telephone, but nothing happens on the internet itself in terms of the game itself.
Thanks for that comment, Timber. Before we carry on with the online questions, I wanted to give the land-based audience an opportunity. Are there any questions? If you can just raise your hand. I see there's one over there. Is there a microphone we can...
Thank you. My question is, we're talking about technological advancements. Now, if we look at our youth, we're also looking at mobile and mobile games. So to a certain extent, there's a fine line between online gambling and the mobile games when you're looking at the spend, the frequency, the addiction, the same kind of problems that you have with an online gambling platform. The only difference is it doesn't fall within the definition of what is a bet, but the effects as far-reaching from a responsible gambling perspective, if you want to look at it like that. So what do you say about that?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'd like Nick to perhaps address it as well as Edward, because the crossover between so-called social gambling or social gaming and more hardcore gaming has become very, very blurred. The UK has taken a very particular position on it. I'd certainly like to hear what South Africa the position as well. Nick, do you?
Yeah, our position is that at the present moment, social gaming is not a matter for the regulator, but it's most definitely a matter for consumer and welfare groups, and we work very closely with those groups. But the border between the two is shrinking, and I think it was most evident when we talked about esports yesterday. I mean, that's a classic example where that border is nigh on porous now. You'll get games providers that will have started under a social gaming intent, as it were, inadvertently straying across the border, or others are dragging them across the border by misusing the products. And the familiarity with social gaming and online gaming, in terms of, you know, my granddaughter, she's 5 now, but she now uses an iPad, and it will be all the same mechanical exercise for her. But it is one that has to be continually monitored. I don't think it's now possible to distinguish a hard line between the two. But the regulator's perspective is, I think quite correctly, determined by the legislation that exists at the time. I think what that points to, and again I think we were picked up previous day, is that in the world of gambling regulation we have to be a lot more agile to reflect the realities of the context that now exist. We passed the original 2005 Gambling Act in 2005. That's 12 years ago. It's out of date, but it was out of date within 3 years. We were then forced to change the law in 2014 to change our licensing regime to go to a point of consumption. And that's quite unknown in Britain. So we passed an act, 2005, didn't become fully operational till 2007. In 2010, we were engaging with the government about the need to change because we realised it wasn't working. 3 years later, we changed it again, and I suspect in another 3 or 4 years, it'll be necessary to review it again. And that's not to say we got it wrong, it's just the reality of the world as we have it now, I think.
Thanks, Nick. Edward, if you would like to comment, and unfortunately after your comment I think we've run out of time and we'll close.
Yeah, I think social game, if you look at what analyzes social gambling, it's an attempt to expose the gamblers who are not online by exploiting the legislation. Because what the underlying objective of social gaming, they offer the same games that you find in a land-based casino. They offer the online. The only difference is that they remove one of the elements of gambling, which is either a payout or a wager. They will encourage people to gamble for free, hoping that once online gambling is legalized, they are ready to participate in gambling. So it's a lacuna that we as regulators were faced with. The issue raised by Portia is that youth are exposed to the same games that are available in regulated market, but simply because of excluding one of the elements of gambling, they are being mushrooming and made available. It's a challenge, as Nick says, that our legislation has to be agile. We look at what is the objective of regulating gambling, protecting the public, protecting the vulnerable, amongst others. Now, if this social gaming is raising the same challenges that are raised, which underlie why we regulate, we need to start amending our legislation to respond to the current reality brought about by this exploitation of legislative framework.
Thanks, Edward. I feel like we've only just started touching on some issues. It's been a very stimulating debate, and I really want to thank every member of the panel this morning. I wish we could carry on for another couple of hours, but all day. It's only fair that we give everyone a break now for 10 minutes or so, and we come back for a more specific panel on secondary lotteries and online betting and the crossover in those areas. And we hope to see you all back in the room in 10 minutes' time. And thanks again to all the members of the panel.
We've obviously covered remote gambling this morning. New forms of remote gambling have developed in some way, shape or form over the last 10 years. Some of the aspects we're going to cover this morning are not necessarily remote gambling related aspects. For example, betting on numbers, as is referred to in South Africa, or betting on the outcome of lotteries is something that happens in retail premises as well, not just through online bookmakers. The more or newer form that we're going to be discussing on so-called secondary or insured-related lotteries is something that has become very prolific around the world only in the last few years, with the rise of the Lottolands, the Jackpot.coms, the Tip24 / Lotto 24/7 operators, and that's become exceptionally prolific, and I know is causing a lot of regulatory issues at the moment. Just by way of introduction, certain jurisdictions are comfortable licensing the same. Other jurisdictions certainly are not. In Australia, we've seen recently, there was an announcement, I think 2 days ago, that Tasmania says that it will not allow its residents going forward to take bets on the outcome of lotteries, whereas the Northern Territories licenses the type of activity. So we in South Africa have allowed bookmakers, by and large, to take bets on the outcome of lotteries for approximately, I think practically it's been happening for just over a decade, and currently is actually exceptionally controversial. It's controversial because the Department of Trade and Industry, in its policy document relating to the gambling industry that it issued almost 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago, sought to put an end in some way, shape or form to the betting or acceptance of bets by bookmakers on the outcome of lotteries. This ended up being open for public comment. Public comment was made. A draft bill was circulated. That, quite frankly, has gone nowhere. But it is something that has become a real issue and is currently the subject of litigation, as well as, I think, a rethink on the part of the Department of Trade and Industry. So I think it's probably best for this issue to be addressed initially by Edward, to give his thoughts on it as a regulator who does permit bookmakers who are licensed within his jurisdiction to accept bets on the outcome of lotteries. Edward, do you want to give some comments on your view as a regulator in that regard?
The framework in South Africa prescribes for different types of licenses, and the classification is based on product offering. For example, if you offer casino games, you'll be given a casino license. If you offer fixed odds, you'll get a bookmaker's license. If you offer a pool bet, pari-mutuel, you'll get a totalizator license. If you offer lottery, what is described as a lottery, you'll get a lottery license. If you look at across all these different forms of gambling, they've got the same elements. You've got a stake, you've got a payout, you risk on an uncertain event, whether you participate through skill or irrespective of skill. They all have the same elements. So the distinction between different forms gets blurred when technology evolves, etc. So in South Africa, bookmakers are authorized to take bets on fixed odds, on any lawful contingency. Now, there's a distinction between taking bets on the outcome of a lottery or offering a lottery. So the two are fundamentally different. If bookmakers take bets on the outcome of an event, if it's a lawful contingency and does not violate the intellectual property of the lottery operator, it's a market like soccer, like any other event. So you can take bets on the outcome of that market. But they cannot run a pool-based system which competes with lottery. Those are the subtle difference between the two.
Right, and I mean, you're saying that from a Gauteng perspective, your fellow regulators in the other provinces take the same position, correct?
Yes, but remember, it's slightly more complex than that. There are variations of what markets you take on. Some will try, let me give you a hypothetical example. Bookmakers are not expected to generate markets on which betting takes place. They cannot have a roulette and use technology to depict it and take bets on it. So the context in which the license were given is that they will process the bets and not generate the markets. Now, with technology, you tend to see in some markets where casino games are offered as markets, people run keno games which happen every second, or they run video lotteries and bet on the outcome of that. So the legal classification will vary from country to country, depending on how products are classified. Now, in South Africa, if somebody offers a market via lottery, offers a market via a casino game, he'll be violating the legislation because he's not authorized to offer bets on it. So the bookmaker can only take bets on lawful events. So you cannot straddle the two, start bring in a random number generator to create a market, because you're not authorized to create a market through the license of a bookmaker.
Right. Mike, you had some comments that you wanted to make from an operator perspective.
Edward has taken the wind out of my sail somewhat, because I want to agree with everything he says. This is where the Lotteries Commission in recent times, in my opinion, have lost direction. They believe they've got the rights to numbers. Not only do they believe they've got the rights to numbers in South Africa, they believe they've got the right to dictate if a bookmaker takes the numbers from another jurisdiction where it's legitimately published, and where that jurisdiction doesn't really care who uses the numbers. We've had a very similar case. There's legal precedent that went right up to our Constitutional Court, where bookmakers were offering a bet called a starting price bet. The starting price bet was a fixed odds where the payout could not be determined, because the payout was going to be aligned to what the tote operator pays out. What the outcome eventually was at the Constitutional Court was that the panel of constitutional attorneys, when they deliberated and delivered their summation, said the following: as soon as the numbers, i.e. the outcome of the tote and the payout of the event, is published, albeit online, through the net, or in hard copy and hard press, anyone could do with it what they want. And what the bookmakers were doing was offering a second tier fixed odds bet based on the outcome of the tote. And what we're seeing here is exactly the same thing. You've got lotteries that offer pool bets. You can't win with one number. You can't win with two numbers. You're lucky if you get 6 Rand or 50 US cents on a 7 Rand 50 bet if you get 3 numbers. In a bookmaker's environment, in a fixed odds environment, you can take a fixed odds bet on one number. You probably get between 5.5 and 6 to 1. So you put $1 down or €1 down, you get back $5.50 or €5.50 or €6. Remember, you can't do that in a lottery environment in our country. Two numbers, you don't get paid out in the lottery, but you get 40 to 1 with a bookmaker. So if you've got 100 Rand down, you're getting 4,000 to 100. You won't see that at the lottery. 3 numbers, I've just told you, you're lucky if you get 6 Rand. If you're really lucky, you'll get 20 Rand back on your 3 Rand. In a bookmaking environment, it's 400 to 1. 400 to 1, ladies and gentlemen. So you put 1 Rand, you get 400 Rand. You put 10 Rand, you get 4,000. Lotteries, you don't get that. And yet they keep harping on the fact that they're in control of the numbers. And they need to, at some stage, be put on their place, because they have no right to dictate to to the gambling boards at a provincial level who have effectively regulated gambling for the past 100 years, but yet they insist they have. And I think it needs to be exposed for what it is, because it's absolutely ludicrous. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Mike. Look, I think in some senses, you know, as attorneys in the industry, we feel the same way. I'd like to turn over to Taz. You know, Taz and Nodostar has been a prolific operator in South Africa for a number of years now, particularly in respect to the betting on lotteries and creative ways in which to also deal with that. I don't want to go into certain things which I think perhaps, unless you're comfortable, you know, to go into as far as the position that the National Lotteries Commission takes on these issues. But, you know, I suppose really this has presented a challenge to the market, and you guys have been at the forefront of that challenge. And really it's more your thoughts on the industry, the conflict that happens, and it's not just in South Africa, between bookmakers who are taking bets on the outcome of lotteries and lotteries. As I said, we've seen it in Tasmania now, but we've seen it in Tasmania now. We've seen it in, I can't remember if it's Queensland or one of the other territories, despite it being licensed by the Northern Territories, and a number of regulators are actually trying to grapple with this issue. So I don't want to ask you any specific question other than to really get your thoughts on it.
So we trade as a bookmaker, and in our point of view, a bookmaker can take a bet on any contingency that we don't control. That's what our National Gaming Act says, and most of our provincial acts seem to align in that perspective. So contingency for us is something we do not control, and we take the bet and we manage the risk on that bet. What we have done is we creatively have taken what our bookmakers have been doing for years, and we just packaged it a different way, in the sense as the mechanics are exactly the same thing. You are placing a bet, but our point of sale, as if you want to call it, on which we are predominantly online, is obviously the feel and the look of actually placing a bet slip, choosing your numbers. So the feel and look, yes, it does feel like a lottery, but the mechanics is you're placing a bet. You get your bet slip has the payout table. The top lines are reinsured by insurance companies that are vetted by the gaming boards. We put up all the guarantees we need to, and this is something that has been happening in Europe for years. We're doing nothing new. We just marketing it very well in South Africa, which has rattled a few cages, to the point where site bookmakers, I don't know if there's another bookmaker in here who can actually agree with me or not. This is bringing in, number betting in South Africa is 70%, up to 70% of a bookmaker's revenue.
Yes.
So because our return to player is far larger than the National Lottery. And this is why our players are astute. They know this. They are aware of this. The other misconception is because it's online, we can't control it. I'm here to say that is not true. Everything is traceable. Our platform goes through vigorous testing by third parties as requested by the Gaming Board. Mpumalanga Gaming Board has ramped up its compliance teams, its audit teams, to actually regulate this online environment. I'm subjected to audits left, right, and center, and I actually understand why I am subjected to this. So from our perspective, we're taking a bet on an outcome we cannot control. Now, if it's random number generated results, or if it is ball results, that argument is all over the place. But now, apparently, last week, our National Lotteries, Ituba, is now not doing ball lottery number, I don't know what it called, results. They've actually turned to random number generators. So that argument is out the pot as well. So it doesn't matter how computerized we're getting, that's the way things are going. And that is our take on it.
So, I mean, I'm going to pass this on to Andre as well, because what you've touched on is a very fundamental issue here. I mean, it strikes me that this is not necessarily per se a matter of law, even though there are legal challenges along the way which make us lawyers very happy, but but actually a question of that the rise of betting on the outcome of lotteries, as well as the newer Tier 1, Tier 2 insured type prize models, the so-called secondary lotteries, is presenting major competition for the national lotteries. Now, Andre, I'm not sure if in the research you've been doing, and I know this is just springing it on you, do you have any observations about the rise of secondary lotteries around the world? I mean, it's been absolutely prolific. We saw, binary options being the next sort of big thing, and CFDs, and that's kind of floated away somewhere. And the next thing that came up very strongly was secondary lotteries all over the world. Lottoland being one of them, who's made a real splash of things. I mean, there's a unique regulatory challenge, I suppose, here between the success of the national lottery in various countries, which does certain things and in principle promotes, the common good and contributes to projects that governments can't really finance, and legitimate betting activity that is happening through other participants in the industry. Is this something we're seeing more and more of? Is there any way, in your view, one can resolve it?
No, it's all going to depend on the provisions in the particular jurisdiction's gaming legislation. I don't feel that I'm adequately informed to comment on the South African situation.
No, I'm asking more from an international
But from an international perspective and looking at what's being talked about, looking at it cold, the only comment I'll probably make that is of somewhat concern to me is the point that Tess has just made, that the outcome can't be controlled. As a former regulator, that concerns me, is that you offer a bet on an event, and that event cannot be controlled by you. My question is, who is controlling that? So you've got a third party who is running that event. It raises all sorts of questions. You can see where it goes.
Sure, but I mean, how different is it in betting on whether the
referee
or the Queen's hair is going to turn purple in 4 seconds' time to what the outcome is published on a newspaper or on television of a national lottery?
There is a difference. There is
Okay.
a slight difference. I mean, if you look at sports these days, integrity in sports is a big issue. And the leagues and the regulators are all talking to each other to make sure that the integrity of that event is not impacted in any way. And if it is, there's ways and means and agreements in place to make sure. It's a pity Nick isn't here, and he might want to comment on that. In this particular case, I'm not suggesting there is a problem. I'm just asking the question. It concerns me if you suggest that event cannot be controlled, because in the end of the day, the question is it fair to the player that he's being allowed to bet on an event which is entirely outside your control? And let me just say, that is the reason why regulators around the world have started to not just look at the entity that faces the player directly. It's my point earlier. You've got to look at the third party who is involved in offering that event as well, and whether it's an associate or
yeah. So you look at, as you mentioned earlier, certification of each level or layer of the supply chain that has anything to do with the gambling transaction. You want to do?
Yeah, if I can just comment, I've been watching the questions coming up on the board. I think they're on the board behind us over there as well as in front of us. And I'm very interested to see, these questions have been coming up as the speakers have been speaking, and a lot of these questions have been answered, and it's interesting to see the type of confusion that still exists. The one question which actually, the first question there, if there are different license types existing, should licensees cannibalize each other's markets and bet types that they offer? It's a very interesting question from a universal perspective, and it goes to the previous panel where I think it was Nick that commented on the border between social games and gambling games becoming finer and finer and harder to define. But in essence, this border in just about all spheres of gambling is becoming finer and finer, because if you look at, for instance, a slot machine versus a Class 2 gaming machine, or what we call a limited payout machine or a pokey, these are separate licenses and distinct forms of gambling from a regulator's perspective, but from a punter's perspective, the machine looks exactly the same. Similarly, the bet type that is being offered by fixed odds as a fixed odds bet by a bookmaker might look like a lottery, but it isn't. So, I think this isn't unique to this particular debate as to whether it's a fixed odds bet on a lottery or whether it's actually a lottery itself. And it's interesting that these type of questions come up because it probably poses an interesting challenge to regulators in terms of how they define their license classes, how they issue such licenses. And then the second question tickled me because it came down to something Taz said about should other bookmakers be allowed to offer product equivalent to Lotto-Star? Well, the answer is yes, and they can.
And they do.
And they do. And the only difference is that Taz is doing a particularly good job, or Lotto-Star doing a particularly good job of marketing it in a unique way. And that's in essence why they've been targeted. But if they are being targeted, it's in the entire industry as well as the regulators, being the issuers of the bookmaker licenses, that are being scrutinized in that process. And I think Mark, in the very beginning, answered the third question. We're just clubbing all of these questions. I'm sure everyone will have an opportunity to pitch in. But when you bet on the outcome of a lottery, is the payout the actual lottery payout or another amount? The adverts are confusing. I'm not sure why, because certainly on the first two numbers, there's no competition as such. There's no payout, so it shouldn't be confusing. And there's fixed odds on the payouts. I think Mark went through them in great detail, 40-1 or whatever. And I think I've answered three of the questions. I'm going to give somebody else an opportunity.
Let me say the following, and I think I'd certainly like some comments in this regard. Is the bearing on the one question about is the payout the same? Well, I think on the tier 1, tier 2 insured type lottery bet, fixed odds bets, sometimes it can be bigger than what the national lottery is paying. And I think for me this is the crux of the matter, about the tension between bookmakers who are actually doing something interesting and competing, but not competing with the national lottery. They're competing on prize size. They're not competing in another way. Taz, you wanted to jump in?
Ironically, what has happened in the past couple of months is it has been said that the National Lotteries has a monopoly on numbers and everything, yes. But ironically, they've introduced new games based on fixed odds bets.
Yeah.
That are happening daily. So they have now come forward and seen there's something wrong with their system, and now they are competing with us, which is fantastic. I know some bookmakers have lodged cases against this, but at the end of the day, it's competition. On good causes, yes, the National Lottery is there for good causes. But the misconception again is the bookmakers, as per their license conditions, most of us have it in our license conditions to give back to good causes, and we are audited on this. I probably, and it's amazing, if the National Lottery has left a gap for us in the good cause department, then we are fulfilling our license conditions and our obligations. Yeah. It's not here's your license and here you go, and it's not let's go online and everyone's happy. We have to give back to good causes, a percentage. I think the Mpumalanga Gaming Board has imposed that on us from the beginning. We return to player is much higher. I think a national lottery has to return to player around 50%. The bookmakers are returning up to 80% of their bets. Our margins are much smaller than the National Lotteries Commission's margins. We are doing our part, and that is just forgotten about. It's like the bookmakers just making money and walking away with money. That isn't the case. To have our license, there are certain things we have to do, and you will testify to this.
No, absolutely.
Our gaming boards are tough on us.
No, absolutely, and I think any of the well-regulated jurisdictions, the gaming boards are tough, and there's a a regulatory tension, if I can put it that way, where there's a huge amount of cooperation, but there's also a slight tension, and it's not an unhealthy tension necessarily. It's a necessary tension. I mean, from my perspective, what we're seeing around the world is that the rise of this is creating problems for national lotteries. The big issue is, what does one do really from a regulatory perspective? You know, one of the aspects, for example, because we live in a rather sophisticated world in certain ways, is can a state sponsor one state licensed activity in a way that skews the competitive playing fields for another duty licensed activity?
There's a question, an interesting question by, it's gone away now under the logo, but there was a question earlier about would the Lotto Star argument, well, it's not, there we go. If a casino published the outcome of each roulette spin, could a bookmaker offer bets on this as per the Lotto Star argument? And I think I'm going to let the panel comment rather than give my own thoughts right now.
No, I want to comment first, if I may. If the regulator allows it under other contingencies, then by all means you can. If the regulator allows it under other contingencies, then you can. Because if it's a legitimate spin, if the randomness of the roulette wheel has been tested and it's not tampered with, etc., then it's not anything untoward.
Let's say in a licensed casino. Yeah.
Exactly.
Let's say in a licensed
What's the difference?
No, I think I'm going to differ with Mike on this point. As I said, legislation, of important to us as a regulator, is to ensure that there's certainty in the market. People invest huge sums of money based on what the rules of the game are. We cannot midstream start changing the categorization of licenses. If casinos are licensed to offer casino games, we cannot start allowing bookmakers to start offering casino games under the guise of fixed odds. So for a casino to start making its roulette available to a bookmaker, that transaction has to be approved first.
Sure.
And the approval will have to have regard to, is it allowed in terms of the framework? So you don't want to create uncertainty in the market by stretching lines and creating very unclear waters. Then you're going to throw away the investment.
May I respond? Our regulator has spoken. The answer is no. Having said that, in a jurisdiction where an activity is also illegal, I think it would be inappropriate for a bookmaker to offer bets on something that is deemed illegal in the country where you reside and where you're taking the bets. Case in point, a couple of years ago, we had to look into dog racing. And after the investigation, our government took a decision that, based on the outcomes of the investigation, that they would not allow legalized dog racing in South Africa. And thus, they said, taking bets on dog racing from elsewhere in the world would undermine what we were seeking to do in our own country. Why would we allow our bookmakers to generate income from something that is deemed illegal in our country? And therefore they prevented it from happening. And here we're not talking dog racing in a virtual environment. We're talking televising dog racing as we would televise UK, North American, Canadian horse racing on an ongoing basis, and from Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, etc. So those are the situations we also have.
There was just one last question about the EBTs masquerading as bingo, which again are these gaming machines, and I think we touched on that in both panels, and it's probably a fitting point to think about close to the end of the panel in terms of the lines again blurring between game types, between what games look like and what they actually are, and license types. But in the interest of time, I'll let Taz make a comment, and then we'll close.
As licensee holders, we'll always push to the limits. We are people that are driven. We obviously want to have the market, and we've been taught that we have to move with technology, we have to move with the time. Ironically, our government departments have to do the same, but they're a little bit slower than us. But saying that, we are totally aware where the line is drawn. So for example, yes, I could make an argument we can take a bet on a roulette number, but that is making enemies where I don't want enemies. There's certain things you can push, and there are holes to it, but do you want to be at loggerheads all the time? It's also a decision to be made. So I ironically agree with both parties. For example, we don't take bets on the national lotteries, our national lottery, because we don't want to compete with them. We've never wanted to, and we never will. And we've made certain decisions based around our country and also the gaming boards. You must understand, even if I'm licensed with the Mpumalanga Gaming Board, we hold certain licenses with different boards, and most bookmakers do, and they can't isolate a gaming board just because they feel like going into war with them. The gaming boards stick together. I've got one license. There are bookmakers that have 150 licenses across the board. So we do know where the line, the push is.
Yeah, we're not so good at not pushing as lawyers. I certainly could make some good arguments as to why roulette should be bet on pretty much any other contingency. Nonetheless, questions from the floor, because we're going to start heading towards wrapping up. It's the end of the conference. Unless Edward has got anything to say, I'd like to thank the panelists here and call on Mr. Fuga, our esteemed president, to make some remarks.
Well, I'd like to thank Wayne and Garen for moderating the sessions this morning, and to all the panelists for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us. It certainly has flown by this morning. It's actually the 2.5 days have flown by since we first opened the conference Tuesday morning and are closing it now. It's been great. I really appreciate everyone here. I hope to see everyone in Copenhagen in September next year. And if anybody has any thoughts or suggestions for topics that they'd like to hear, ones from here that were started and continuing the discussions next fall, please let us know. Thank you.
I'll set up your whole I used to do it overseas.
kalunga wenze njani bo ini wenze njani bo sambu ingomo emasimbini eshakula matole yakabiteka watinu mama kini yakaligomo yakaligomo yakaligomo